Hey everybody, welcome back to You Are What You Love. I'm your host, Marissa Tandon, and my guest today is a friend and colleague of mine from the audio drama space. You've heard her work in projects like Station Blue and The Goblet Wire. So, Ester Ellis, thanks for coming on and welcome to the show.
Thanks. I'm so happy to be here.
I'm so happy to have you. Tell me, today, what are we talking about? What's the thing that changed who you are as a person?
We're talking about Stranger Things, which feels, somewhat topical, given that they finally made it to that finish line.
Whew, yeah, we're very, very close. There's only one season left.
Mm-hmm.
It's the talk of the town. This is a more recent show than we normally talk about, so that's, I think, pretty exciting too. So it's a more recent change for you. I would love to know when was the first time you remember seeing the show, or how did you get into it?
So I got into it in 2016 when the first season came out. I was hiking the Pacific Crest Trail, which is the Mexico to Canada trail on the California side that goes just through all the Sierras and then all the or most of the Cascades. And I had made it to Oregon. So it was a couple, almost, 1,600 miles in of just living outside, and stayed with our musician buddy Travis, stayed with his dad who lives in Oregon. And I got a bunch of messages. I didn't get internet access too often. So I got a bunch of messages from people saying, like, hey, this show's on Netflix. It looks up your alley. And I saw a poster for it in this town, but like a small poster in like a video store. So I watched it all pretty much in one sitting, maybe in two, I think, because I was there for 3 days. So I started it that night and then finished it the next day. And I thought I thought it was great. I don't think it quite hit me until later, because when you live in the woods for a long time and you're hiking 20 to 35 miles a day, anything you watch gives you about a week's worth of entertainment in your brain. And I didn't anticipate it having success just because the people who recommended it to me, like, kind of knew what my niches were.
Yeah.
And some of the themes of it fit. At the time I was working on Station Blue. I had a handful of scripts. I had the outline. I was just developing specifics while I was hiking. And there were like definitely elements where I felt like we were drinking some of the same Kool-Aid. So it felt really good to like watch something and be like, aha, there's media that's like, I mean, Station Blue and Stranger Things are quite different, but I feel like the influences are very similar. Like watching it, I'm like, I wonder if they like Silent Hill. And it's like, okay, they do. And I wonder if they like that. So I kind of like eventually went through their stuff and was like, all right, they were kind of watching a lot of similar stuff to me when and like taking in similar influences that made my show. And then when I came home at some point, I just watched it again. And that's when it like clicked, and you kind of go into that, I don't know what it's called, but you watch something and then for 3 days, you're just kind of absorbed in it. And that doesn't happen to me very often with media. So I was very excited.
Yeah. So like almost like a level of that hyperfixation space where you start to really kind of, all you're thinking about, it takes it over.
Yeah, it leaves like an emotional mark.
Yeah.
Usually on the rare occasion I encounter media like that, I try to like put it on buy it and put it on a shelf, just so that like when I'm writing, I can kind of look at that shelf and go like, is it possible for me to bring the emotions that like I felt and potentially other people felt going into this? And I have like next to no like experience with fan spaces. So I think this was the first thing I was just like a fan of in a more traditional way when we think of fans. And it was not until season 4 that I've actually like had access, been like plugged into the part of the internet talking about it. So last month has been delightful because I'm like, oh, people are like having insights about that thing I like.
Oh, interesting. So would you say like growing up, you didn't really have a big connection to sort of fandom or the internet or that kind of thing?
Yeah, not at all. Like I really liked things. But like I was making art for a lot of it. And so like, for example, I did a lot of painting in high school, but I didn't really have a favorite painter, because when I went to a museum, I was just like, okay, what are these people doing? I think it's this like almost instinct to like to treat other creators as peers and to figure out what were they doing when they were like as bad or inexperienced as me. And I think part of it's just like upbringing. Like I was the oldest in my family, like I was the oldest kid. I was in like the oldest of like different scout groups. I was always kind of in this weird middle space. So I never had like people to look up to.
Yeah.
And still like, anytime I find someone now that I look up to, I tell them and I'm like, hey, I look sideways at like just about everybody, right? I'm just like, oh, this person's great. Like I get very passionate about other people. But it's rare that like I encounter something where I'm like, oh, I like want to seek mentorship here.
Mm. Well, so where did you grow up?
I grew up in just the not great side of Vegas for the first like 10 years. And then I lived in Ohio for a year, which was a paradise. And then spent most of my upbringing in the San Francisco Bay Area.
Okay.
And then I moved to LA like 5 or 6 years ago, but I keep like bouncing all over the country whenever I get the chance because I work remotely. So someone's like, I'm driving here. I'm like, I will come.
Well, I really like this idea of kind of like it's an interesting mentality that I don't think a lot of people have, but being able to view other artists as peers as opposed to putting people on sort of a pedestal, which I think is cool because I think being a fan sometimes comes from that space of putting something out of reach. But it sounds like you've been able to kind of view masters of work as what can I learn from this as someone who could achieve something myself.
Yeah, and that's, I didn't start writing until what 2015, 2016, and then those were all for like audio drama things. So I was new to it, but I'd worked in a bookstore for, since college, and so I was constantly reading, constantly getting other people's recommendations and talking about that kind of thing. But I have this like, I don't know, there's times and this comes out in my work where I just feel like my head has just like its own arms and mouths of like I'm just trying to like grab things and cannibalize,
Yeah.
just reduce them to their base parts and go like, what's useful here? Which was like an instinct I wasn't like stoked about, but I think I found productive uses of it.
Hmm.
So like a lot of times, even if I'm watching a movie, like I just watched Elvis and I hated it because I hate music biopics. Like I knew I was gonna hate it going in. It was more interesting than I thought, but it was still a music biopic. Like shout out to everyone who loves those movies because I know those are usually like a reliable way to like get inspiration and feel good every year when they make another one.
Yeah.
Um, so for me, I'm just sitting there and I'm like, what can I get out of this viewing experience? All right, how are they doing the storytelling? How are things rhyming? Like, what's going on here? But at the same time, it can make it more difficult to enjoy media in a just turn your brain off way.
Yeah.
And Stranger Things in particular is one I've all like, actually, I was a huge fan of Ninja Turtles when I was a kid.
Okay.
Like from, I think Turtles was one of my first words.
Which turtle?
Michelangelo was my turtle when I was younger. And I I was all about those. Like I was very like familiar with fan spaces. Like I've read comics for a long time. Like often when people are like, oh, what's nerd stuff? Like I'm up on the nerd stuff. I think it's just the way I interact. But I remember watching Ninja Turtles 3, which like in hindsight is a really bad movie, but I loved it when I was a kid where they like go to Japan and become samurai.
Yeah.
And I watched it so many times in like a 2-week period that I remember one time I was just like, oh, this is fun. I can just keep watching this. And I put it on in the afternoon and 20 minutes into it, I'm like, this movie is dead for me. I broke it.
Oh no.
And I was like 9. And so
like it's over.
even when I do enjoy things, I'm always afraid of engaging with them too much because I'm like, what if, I can't recapture that feeling?
Yeah.
And Stranger Things is a piece of media I'm still careful with. Like I won't just like watch it over and over again. But every time I sit down, even if like with season 4 coming out, I'm like, all right, I'm excited. I'm also a little worried because it's a new thing. And I think we've encountered media in the last like 5-6 years that has kind of ruined the franchise. And I didn't think that was going to happen. But, there's a worry. But then like I start watching and my brain just turns off and I just like enjoy it. And I'm also, I can never predict where they're going.
Do you think there's something in particular about Stranger Things, maybe season 1 or even kind of the more recent seasons that strikes that chord that lets you kind of just enjoy it specifically, since it sounds like you're always in a sense ready to analyze, and this seems like a show that has allowed you to just sort of watch?
Yeah, for one thing, the idea of like horror that's not necessarily scary but is horror is very appealing to me. Most of my things are horror oriented, but they're mostly emotional oriented. It's just like I relate to things that happen in horror more because of, my own emotional experience on the day to day. It helps me like resonate with it. So it already had a setting that I was like comfortable with. And like the 80s nostalgia, I think I don't like that's not the appeal to me, but it does make the craft really fun. Like the part of it that I like isn't like, oh, this is 80s. These are things I kind of, grew up around. It's, oh, they have a specific point of view, and a strong point of view is something I always love. But I think the first thing that like, so it was already like in subject matter set up for me to like it. But I did a lot of acting basically until I moved to Los Angeles, ironically. just lots of stage acting. And I come from a very like intense performance community college. Like it's a community college that just so happens to be have this like really good theater and this like elite group of acting teachers who followed this like legend who decided to retire there.
Yeah.
Um,
This is, up in the Bay?
yeah,
Yeah.
Diablo Valley College,
Cool.
which is up in the East Bay, just like on the other side of the hills from Oakland and Berkeley. And so watching the thing that I think really stood out to me was both David Harbour and Millie Bobby Brown's performances
Mm.
because they lined up with the kind of acting style that I came from. And then later when they were doing interviews and stuff, they kept putting them together, which I'm like, "Oh, this makes a lot of sense." And the way they talked about acting, I'm like, "Cool. This was always my approach to acting." So on top of having like subject matter I also, these performances were fascinating and familiar to me
Mm.
and just really well done. And I love that it seems like they recognize that too, because then they attached those two characters together in future seasons.
Yeah.
So, but it's that, and then it's just there's like a level of detail in the show. Like I think a lot of people, they're like I've seen a lot of it doesn't feel like one of the most popular pieces of media in the world to me at all, because I rarely meet people who are like, I love Stranger Things, let's talk about it. Everyone's like, yeah, Stranger Things is fine. It's like the way they talk about like, I don't know. Marvel movies is incorrect because I feel like everyone who engages with Marvel is at least invested. That's like part of the fun of those.
Yeah, yeah. Whether you hate it or you love it.
But I don't. If something's good, people are like, yeah, it's good. They'll have criticisms that I just thoroughly disagree with because I've watched it very attentively multiple times, and like they make the show in a way where there's all these little details they're never going to point out to you. So there's all this stuff to find, and it like everything about it feels very intentional, which I really like. Like it's easy for me to be present while watching the show because like there's one detail that I picked up on in the second season for a bit, and then in the third season more of like David Harbour has this wristband, this like hair band around his wrist in the
Oh,
first and
yes.
second season.
Yeah.
And like later I went back and watched, I'm like, oh, that's his dead daughter's hairband. Like when she went to the hospital, she was wearing it, and then when she lost her hair, he started wearing it. And then later in the show, when 11 has it, you're just like, that is such a powerful, like the implications of that are, blow my mind. And they've never brought attention to it outside of like when he's nervous, he fiddles with it. When they're having a good movement, they both kind of have like, their arms in each other and they're both like touching it. It's just like, that was something those two actors decided to do. And no, but they don't feel the need to like draw attention
Yeah,
to
there's
it.
no line that's like, "Ah, yes, me and my hairband that my adoptive father gave me that was," yeah, it's
Right.
they don't have to
They
kind of
just
call it.
do it. And there's still stuff I miss that like other people get to tell me, which is fun. So like season 4 has been the first time I'm like, oh, people are like talking about this a lot.
Yeah.
People are engaging with it a lot. It's been a blast because like Stranger Things was something I wanted to find fan spaces because I was very I don't know, very aware that I could talk someone's ear off about it and that they probably wouldn't appreciate that very much. But there were times I did want to talk about it. So it just felt like I was cashing in like friend points. I was just like, cool, I think I've earned enough goodwill from this person to talk to them about this for 45 minutes.
So, you know what's so interesting about kind of your experience with this and the little things that you're talking about to me is that as someone who grew up on Tumblr and on those fan spaces very intensely, a lot of stuff that you're talking about being the best part of the show is the stuff that sort of builds fan spaces. Those little tiny moments that everyone obsesses over and slows down the screenshots of and makes like slow GIF sets of. I feel like I've now just caused a war about whether it's GIF or GIF, but it is what it is.
It's 2022. Do whatever you want.
It's GIF. And so I think what's interesting is that it sounds like you kind of found the same instinct that fan space is centered around and built around, but by yourself to some degree.
Yeah.
And, I'm kind of curious, like, did you find yourself wanting to find those little things more so in this show than you had when you were kind of viewing things as someone looking for pieces for your own work with that analytical mind? Is this like the first time you started really obsessing over those little things?
I think, like, I've always loved I mean, that's something that's really strong, I think, about audio dramas. A lot of audio drama really serves a second listen,
Yeah.
because you don't have the visual detail. So even if something was meant to be obvious, you might miss it until your second listen.
Yeah.
And so anytime you have a piece of media that like serves a second viewing or like it intends for you to do that again, and it happens a lot in books,
Mm.
um, and it's appealing to me. It's just it can be hard to find those things, or they'll, this is something comic book movies tend to do, is they'll put in a bunch of Easter eggs.
Yeah.
But I think there's a difference between like an Easter egg and something that is like an actor or a director choice that they don't need to call attention to, but that does make the thing better. Like oftentimes, like your brain notices it even if you don't necessarily.
Right.
So this is the one I think I've engaged with the most. Like a lot of media, I like it. It is good on multiple watches, but like I don't trust a lot of media. I don't expect it from media, and I don't trust a lot of media to do that. And especially since starting writing, I just have like ironically less time for as much media as there is right now. Like I'm really stoked about how good media has been.
Mhm.
Um, and there's some places I lament too, because I'm like, there's definitely you see like I don't know if you saw like RRR this year,
I've heard
or
so much
everything.
about it, but I haven't seen it yet.
It's on Netflix.
Yeah.
Yeah, you should watch it. It's incredible.
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
you in particular, I think would love it just based on like how I've heard you talk about Marvel. I think it has a lot
Yeah,
of
well,
that
it's
core,
a Bollywood film. It's from my people, so so I'll be
and it's just like about these two like superhumans, but who aren't superhumans. Like they're superhumans in their friendship and their like care and their authenticity, and it just lets them like be that,
Mm.
while also being beautifully structured. Like I think people get into it because they're like, oh, there's tigers and explosions. And I'm like, that's not the good part. Like those parts are a blast and they definitely serve the characters, but or like everything everywhere all at once. Part of me is like, oh, I watch these movies. I'm like, this is the best movie I've seen because I feel like most of the movies we have are good, but like less of them are great, or they
Mm.
don't, allow. Like I think there's a reason a lot of media people are enjoying or coming from other countries,
Yeah.
and I take great relief from the global stage of creators on like even if we get to the point where we only want to make reboots, like, and I don't think that's actually true. Like I think if you look for movies, you'll find great movies,
Yeah.
but at least for other places, it's like okay, it's not you don't have to worry about that as much.
Well,
Um,
what's interesting about that though is there is such a push these days in American media in Hollywood to do kind of just reboots, reboot on reboot on
yeah,
reboot, and not original IP. But I think Stranger Things, perhaps one of the reasons why it is doing so well is that it's familiar. It has that same sort of kids on bikes genre of it, or that familiarity of horror. But it is
yeah.
original. It is something new.
It's something that fascinates me, and there's a word for this, and I do not remember it because I'm a bit sick, but Stranger Things, like, works both ways. Like, for me, I think season 2 came out, I started doing movie nights for a little bit where people who really like Stranger Things just, at work or whatnot, who hadn't seen Goonies or hasn't seen E.T. or all of that, I'm like, "Oh, let's watch the movies that go into this." And watching Stranger Things first allowed them to appreciate things like E.T. or the Goonies in the same way we're watching E.T. or the Goonies helps you appreciate Stranger Things.
Mm.
Like it's not just referential, it it works as a source material for its influences. Is that interdependent? I don't. They're smart media people have given words for it, but unlike other things where it's like, oh, if you haven't seen this movie, this other movie doesn't really work, but if you have, it's a lot of fun.
Yeah, it's not like there are homage elements to a degree and referential elements, but you can go both ways. I think what's interesting about Stranger Things in particular is kind of uh, partially what you were talking about with the 80s nostalgia. It's not just here's a movie that's set in or a show, unless you're watching season 4, which is, movies.
Basically, yeah.
But it's not here's a show that's set in the 80s and here's some really cool 80s stuff. Here's a show that has an 80s point of view and
Yeah.
it's part of the show.
And that's like the only weakness of season 2 to me. Season 2, they didn't have as strong of a point of view. Like season 2 was a Stranger Things season.
Yeah.
And then they went hard in season 3 with like, cool, we're doing summer blockbuster.
Yeah.
And then they went hard in season 4 where they're like, cool, we're gonna do more of a, Hellraiser, like later 80s feel to the thing. So they let themselves like explore a different, very specific thing, even though that comes with risks. To me, it's better to take a risk and have a strong POV. Like, I love season 3. A lot of people didn't like season 3, and I could talk forever about why season 3 is actually good and people's complaints about it. If like if you look at what's happening behind the scenes, like they're dealing with the same things that people are complaining about. But even for me, I wasn't expecting a summer blockbuster when I first watched it. So I had a weirder first experience, at least for the first 3 or 4 episodes. But then when I came back, I'm like, "Oh, this is the most fun season."
What's so funny to me is I did not know people didn't like season 3 as much as I mean, I loved.
People hate season 3. Like
That's wild. It's such a good Steve season.
you get Steve, you get Robin,
Yeah.
you get Billy as someone who's like elevated to that like Millie Bobby Brown like performance and attention level. But a lot of it's Hopper. People were just not ready to see Hopper like that.
Yeah.
And I think that will work better with season 4 because some like David Harbour, like Stranger Things is one of the only things I've gone out and sought interviews for and like, fan panels to just see like what's going on in these people's head. And I haven't done that too much like in the last couple years. Which shows you how like I don't know how to interact with fan spaces. I don't have that upbringing or that training or that socialization. So I'm just like, oh, I could probably look up an interview. This would be fun. And once the pandemic kicked in and I think they realized like, oh, this show's not coming out for a while. David Harbour just started going on random YouTube channels and not like big YouTube channels and just talking to people. And, he like me going through season 3, I was just like, all right, there's something off about this. What's off about this? I am going to figure it out because I refuse to feel off about a piece of media I like this much. Like,
Yeah.
for me, Stranger Things doesn't need to be good. I could find a way to like it even if it wasn't good, but I do think it's very good. And he talked about season 3 setting up this like 3-season arc
Mm.
of like, you have this character who was raised by World War II vets. He went from that to going to Nam to becoming a New York police officer. He's had no good examples of masculinity in his life. He has no like ability to engage, like no history with any of this stuff. And now you have he's used to fighting his problem with either drugs, alcohol, or violence.
Yeah.
And you get to season 3, and kind of the important thing to me about season 3, as far as the whole show goes, is all of these characters are mostly at peace. And so we get to see what they're like just on a day-to-day when they don't have problems and they don't have to be heroic. And people weren't ready for that. Like, people hate on Mike all the time. And I'm like, I loved that, they're like, cool, we're going to do this. Not will they, won't they, but we're going to do this. Are these characters ever going to be able to like get a few moments to themselves?
Yeah.
And the first thing they open on is just the worst teenage stuff ever. They're like, we're not making this appealing at all. We're just going to make you regret watching these kids grow up. And I think that works. Right. Well, because everyone's like, the kids used to be cute. I'm like, yeah, now they're shitty teenagers, but they're making 2 more seasons. So they're probably not going to be shitty teenagers
By the end. Yeah.
by next season. And lo and behold, they weren't. Like, and I think that's a thing where like I trust the Duffer Brothers a lot to not, I guess, fall in love with themselves and not like go the obvious route.
Yeah.
Like when I saw the trailers for season 4 and you see 11 and she just looks ridiculous. I'm like, somehow she has the Byers bowl cut,
Yeah.
and she's wearing like a baggy dress over like either Mike or Hopper's like shirts. She's like doing all I'm like, that rules, because I feel like most other creators would have made her a cool goth.
Yeah.
Right? They're like, she has psychic powers. We're going to make her great. And it's like, no, she doesn't know. She doesn't have an education.
Yeah.
Like, she doesn't know how to engage with people. She's enthusiastic about it. And she's really good at like some specific things. And so I was just like, yes, they keep doing it.
Yeah.
Like, don't get me wrong. I love it when 11 looks cool, but I love it more when she just looks like a clown, because it just shows like knowing a character.
Mm.
And so I kind of knew with season 3, all right, they need to like metaphorically kill this Hopper, because there's no way this character, everything you've seen him do, would be able to handle being a parent kind of the way you'd want him to. Like, he's terrified. Half of his like sad moments in the first 2 seasons are him just thinking about his daughter, and now he has a daughter who's rebelling against him.
Yeah, I thought maybe that's why I was so surprised that that people didn't like season 3. Is I thought that was I think what appeals to me about the show maybe sounds like it's the same thing that appeals to you, which is these character moments where it is some of these very deep and hard portrayals of people in these circumstances that are not I think there's the easy kind of route with this genre of here are some badass superheroes that are dealing with trauma and they're, coming out the right way on it. And then there's the version of it, which is what Stranger Things does, which is here is some of the most horrifying circumstances that no one was expecting. And here are human and layered reactions to what that would mean. Um,
Yeah.
and I think Hopper in particular is someone who had already experienced so much trauma prior to everything becoming supernatural, and becoming wild. So you have someone who already had to deal with that and already had these kind of problems with how they deal with that trauma, trying to deal with a now hyper level of trauma. And so it's interesting. It's sometimes it seems as though people want a superhuman response rather than a humanity, like a portrait of humanity.
Well, and I also think at the point they get attached to the character, they then after that want the character to behave well.
Mm,
Like the thing that made them love the character are not necessarily behaving well, but doing the best you know how to do. But then you keep watching it and it's like, well, they're going to keep doing that. Whereas at this point, you're attached to a very specific version of this character
yeah,
and an appeal of like there's people who are like, season one was the only good one. I'm not interested in the show after that. And like, lucky for them that you can stop at the end of season one and you're good,
yeah,
but if they were going to make more of the show, because it kind of made this like perfect first season, this is how you do it, right? You let it go big. You let us like really explore. Even if it frustrates me sometimes, I'm just like, let the characters like each other with, let them communicate. Like I definitely had that panic for parts of season 4 early on. I'm like, I know these episodes are long and like I hope they let them communicate. And then they did, and I was like, okay, good.
yeah.
And part of that's like my own involvement. At this point, because to me they landed season 4.
Mhm.
Like season 5, I'm like, you can do whatever you want now.
Mm,
Right?
yeah,
Like you gave me everything I wanted, even if I didn't know I wanted it. Like I can never predict where the show's going, which I think is great.
yeah.
And like a sense that I get like reading interviews, and part of why I think I identify with the show is um I think the Duffer Brothers approach media the same way I do. Like I think in making it, they're not just trying to make referential, they're trying to look at like what worked about this and treat other creations as like peer groups, even if they themselves are like nerding out about it now to get to work with all their heroes. They're still ultimately like, how do we make like a good thing that stands alone that you could put, in this place?
Something I'm curious about is that you said that you were hiking the Pacific Crest Trail when you first watched this show, which is
Mhm.
insane to me as someone who likes to sit still and do nothing. Um,
It's insane to me now that I did that. Like you get back to society and after 6 months, you're like, what, how, I don't want to be cold and sore and at low altitude.
well, yeah, so that's what I'm curious about is like that's such a specific frame of mind to have pulled something like this into your life. Like how long
Mhm.
had you been hiking at this point? How long had it been since you had talked to someone?
I was at the Oregon border by then. So I had all of Oregon and Washington to hike, but like Oregon and Washington together are, you know, 1,000 miles, whereas California is 1,600 miles.
Okay.
Or maybe Oregon and Washington are 800 miles or something. So like by then you're in the home stretch, and Oregon's also like relatively easy because you're used to going up and down mountains all day in California, and you get to Oregon and it's relatively flat. Like people were managing to do 40 and 50 miles a day if they wanted to. And when I say relatively flat, it's still hills, but it's not the tallest peaks, on the West
I
Coast.
would love for you to
Um,
know that I am horrified right now. But yes, 40, 50 miles a day, whatever. That's fine.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and it's not usually a good idea to hike that much. Like you get to the point where you can hike 40 if it's in that terrain. And like I was doing like 30 or 35 in like Washington, which is intense again. But by then you're like an Olympian,
Yeah,
right?
right.
All you've been doing is walking for 5 months. Like you've trained your body to do the thing literally every single day for that period of time. I mean, yeah, you're in. I definitely jumped in. I think you had a question
Oh,
attached to it.
no,
I might
no,
have missed it, but
I'm curious. For me, and I assume for most of the people listening, this is that kind of frame of mind is a totally different space than something I'm aware of or I'm used to. Um,
yeah.
and to be kind of by yourself in that space and then to sort of come up for air, and the thing that you come up for air to is Stranger Things, which is
Mhm.
focused on someone who's been sort of isolated from society and reintegrating
Yeah.
themselves. I'm just curious if maybe that's part of something that pulled you in, or um, how you identified with those characters in that first season.
Oh, I mean, it was definitely like an ideal way of watching it, especially because that was the only piece of media I got to watch for the last, you know, 8, 900 miles of the trail. Cause like the further you get into Oregon and Washington, there's no longer places that have internet or TV or any of that. So that was kind of something to chew on. But also with the show I was making, like the reason I had written, chunks of it before leaving, but then I was developing it on the trail is because it's about a person who's isolated, mentally ill in Antarctica by themselves. And they go through a lot of really hard stuff.
Yeah.
And I try to, with the show, pay respect to that hard stuff. It's like I'm not torturing this character for no reason. And so being out there, there's definitely a lot I put into the show from those experiences that I think helped make it more authentic. And then with this show, like especially, yeah, you have a lot of isolated characters. And then you have a lot of found family, and a lot of hiking the Pacific Crest Trail is found family because you end up hiking around the same groups over time, like people who are kind of naturally doing the same mileage or naturally finding the same campgrounds
Yeah.
bring you together, and you're often from like completely different walks of life. So it actually like lended itself pretty well to that. Plus, just being in the woods, a lot of the horror in that show takes
Yeah,
place
it's
in
in
the
the woods.
woods, and so you're just like, it's almost a relief when you clear tree line, which is the point in which trees can no longer grow because it's too high. You're almost relieved because you're like, cool, I'm not in these like primordial Washington woods where all of these like horror podcasts take place.
Oh, man. Yeah, my only frame of reference for, the Pacific Crest Trail is the Reese Witherspoon movie, Wild, which
I need
is
to I need
based
to
off that book.
rewatch that.
Oh, what a film. But just know that that's how I'm imagining you is is
Imagine it more extreme than that because
okay.
she made life hard for herself. Her pack was probably 4 times heavier than mine,
Okay.
'cause I had a pretty light pack. Like, at that point, I was fairly experienced, and I knew if you're gonna hike all day, like, bring as little as you can.
Yeah.
Um, and she also started, like, halfway through the desert, and then she missed all the best parts because she gets to the Sierras, and then she just jumps around them and then hikes to Oregon and then kinda hops off. And I'm like, "You missed all of the mountains," which, like, the mountains are hard, but they're also pretty, whereas the desert's just, like, a struggle.
Yeah.
Like, there's no water, there's sand, there's fungi in the wind that gives you
Oh.
flu symptoms.
Oh,
Like,
okay.
yeah,
So
yeah,
what made you want to go on that hike? Like, how did you come to that
I
decision?
I don't know. I mean, like, I I don't know. I just did it. I just felt like doing it, and so I did it. I don't have a good reason,
Yeah.
and I think that's the best everyone I know who's hiked, like, they tend to get further if they don't have a specific goal out there other
Yeah.
than just, like, the mountains were calling to me. They were haunting me. I was dreaming about them. Um, because if you have a specific thing you're trying to achieve or discover about yourself, you're gonna discover that within 1,000 miles.
Yeah.
You're gonna get to Lake Tahoe, you're gonna have gone through 700 miles of desert, you're gonna have to gone through some of the most beautiful mountains in the world. You're gonna get to Lake Tahoe, which is just such a fun place. And now you're not even halfway through, right? You've
Right.
had an entire Lord of the Rings worth journey, and you've walked about as long as they do in Lord of the Rings. Because they walk about 1,100 miles in Lord of the Rings, from Hobbiton to Mount Doom. And it's like, cool. Now what's going to keep you going for the next 3.5 months?
Right.
Like you've achieved your goal. Whereas if you're just like one of those weirdos like me, that's just like mountains are calling to me. I gotta go.
Yeah, you gotta go. Oh my goodness. Well, you know what? I think I like that better as an inciting incident of just I want to go, so I'm going. I
Yeah,
think that's cool. Um,
yeah.
I think this is a lot about you as a person. I feel. I understand you.
It certainly does. I mean, that's the same thing with making a podcast. I'm just like, I want to make a podcast. I've never written anything or recorded anything or designed, edited. I haven't done any of this. I feel like doing it. Let's go.
Yeah. Okay, so getting back to Stranger Things, I think one thing that's been popping out to me recently, and I think you kind of touched on it when you were talking about trusting the Duffer Brothers, is that I think now, media now has gotten to a point where anybody can say anything they want about the show, and it can be said very publicly. Um, And I
Mhm.
think there is a lot of that with Stranger Things. There is a lot of kind of questioning whether a choice was right, or not even necessarily questioning, but asserting that a choice was wrong. Um,
Yeah.
so how do you, now that you're engaging in fandom, how do you feel about creators having to work through that, and whether that affects the way the art is made?
I feel like you wanna take in criticism when it's good, you wanna grow. I
Yeah.
don't think it's good to shut your brain off, but I also don't think you can make choices based on how people are going to react to them,
Mm.
because you're not other people. You don't have control over how they're gonna react to things. You just have to, like, follow your point of view and follow, like, that 'cause this is certainly not true, but for me, creation is the process of creation is like ripping your guts out and putting it on a table and rearranging
Yeah.
it, right? It comes from this very core place. Like, even for me, there were always trans narratives in Station Blue, but I didn't realize how deep they went. And, now working on transitioning and, like, going back to the show, I'm just like, "Oh, I told on myself, like, 4 or 5 years ago." And I was living that, like, non-binary life at the time, so it's not like I was, like, operating under the assumption that I was cis, but I was just definitely trying to write the main character as cis, just because at the time there weren't a lot of trans people in media, and I'm like, "I don't wanna torture this person meaninglessly," like, or I don't wanna torture, like, a queer person, whereas now it's like, "Okay, we have enough queer, at least in our medium, like, enough queer people, yeah, you can torture them a bit, like, be responsible." And now I'm just like, "Oh god, yeah, I told on myself a lot because it all came from me and all those decisions came from me."
Mm.
So, with a creator, I think you have to accept when you've arrived at a decision, that will upset people or they'll disagree with. But, like, ideally, you are also build trust and consistency. Like, I've definitely seen people rant about, deaths that have happened or not happened in season 4. And I think based on where those people were coming from, they were making really good points, but because it seemed like they had only engaged with the show intensely by season 4, there was something they missed. And I made one of those Twitter threads that I knew was gonna get about 3 likes, and it did. But I wanted to make it, so I did, about like, "Hey, here's what death is in this show." Like, death is not about being heroic, right?
Mm.
It is not about redemption in Stranger Things. Stranger Things is ultimately a horror story, even if it's one of the most, accessible pieces of horror media out there, and a lot of that comes down to the characters, right?
Yeah.
And the love and the care that is, like, demonstrated in the cast. And that goes for a lot of really scary movies. A lot of really scary movies are easier to stomach if the characters are really well done. And they almost don't feel like horror movies when you walk away from them, at least in my experience.
Yeah.
I'm sure there's people who are like, "No, I was just scared." And so I'm like, "No, the deaths here are tragedies." The deaths are the result of systems that are the bad things in this show.
Mhm.
And the deaths are meant, the character, just because a character says something doesn't mean that is correct.
Right.
Right? Because every single character in the show has dysfunctions and they have places where they think they're deficient, but none of their friends think that they're deficient. Um, and so when someone's like, "Oh, I'll do a season 2 spoiler because I feel like that's safe."
I think,
In
yeah, if you're listening and you haven't listened to you haven't watched season 2, I can't help you. Spoiler
Yeah,
alert.
no, I'm sorry, we're gonna go forward. Is Bob, right?
Yeah,
Bob dies.
right.
Bob Newby, superhero, and he says like, "Oh, I." Bob's thing is he's just really happy to be with Joyce. He was a nerd in school when like Hopper and Joyce in school were like the kids smoking out back.
Yeah.
And he like Bob sees himself as having this deficiency of being a nerd, of not quite being worthy of Joyce, but being very grateful to be with her. And when he makes it's not even a sacrifice. He takes risks, but he wasn't intending on necessarily sacrificing himself, but he was trying to be a hero. At no point where they're like, "Wow, Bob died for a reason," right?
Mm.
It's like Bob did save lives the way he died, kind of, but not really, actually. Like, if you look at it, Bob's risk saved lives. Bob's death did nothing.
Yeah.
And that's all the deaths in Stranger Things, like all of them. If you look at them, it is like, no, this character thought they were deficient. So when you're watching, maybe season 4, and spoilers, there's going to be characters that die and characters that don't die. Stranger Things, like, this is probably all fandom. You could tell me there's a lot of like misquoted like headlines that just become gospel really quickly.
Yeah, I've noticed that.
Like Millie Bobby Brown was like, "Oh, we need to kill way more characters," and the Duffers were like, "This is Hawkins, not Westeros."
Yeah.
But like the Millie Bobby Brown quote was happening during a photo shoot, and she's like, we can't fit everyone in the shoot. We need to kill some
Yeah, I
characters."
was gonna
Like it
actually
was,
bring that up. I thought it was so funny because that whole thing, which again is something I think people forget about this show, is that the actors are children, like they are
mhm,
teenagers, and they were not teenagers when they started the show. Like they are youthful kids who have
yeah.
grown up in the public eye. First of all, but second of all, the amount of twisting that it takes for Millie Bobby Brown to make an offhand comment about how big the cast has gotten to then become Millie Bobby Brown said, "This is what should be done about the show," for the Duffer Brothers to then have to respond to it, but also not even realize that she wasn't criticizing them, I think it is a wild twist that's come out of this fandom in particular.
Yeah, well, and I think, it's people like that was a lot of people like, I can't do at the time, they're like, "I can't do season 3 because Hopper's too much."
Mm,
And for me, I'm just like, Hopper's always been this way.
yeah,
You're just seeing it, and like, I agree. I don't like season 3 Hopper in his actions and whatnot, but I'm like, it's still Hopper.
yeah,
And with that, there's people who get really hung up and like they're like the show and most horror shows kind of give you the rules of death early on. Season 4, by episode 3, I made bets on who was going to live and who was going to die, and I was right.
yeah.
I was like, so when people are like, "Oh no, I think this," it didn't even make it onto mine and my partner's bingo card, like one of the deaths, because I'm like, just know this is. They've been telling us this is going to happen
Yeah,
for most of the season, um, and so it's just like one of those things of like there are rules and like these things mean things. But also it's great that even me knowing that created a sense of dread, right? I think that like watching the show is a more intense experience for me knowing or thinking I knew who was like gonna die and who was gonna live.
mhm,
And there were definitely points because like you're a writer, right? There's rules with writing.
right.
Like you can't kill Jon Snow twice. Like once Jon Snow gets killed, you don't get to kill that character again because then that's just really unsatisfying,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah.
I think that's a problem Walking Dead ran into is people are just like, oh, anyone can die. But I also feel like I'm like, they're kids. Like, do people need to die in this show?
Yeah.
Sometimes.
Yeah, no, I think it is interesting because I think death in media and especially in something like this, there is this sort of when the Duffer Brothers made their comment about kind of this is Hawkins and we don't have to kill everybody.
Hmm.
I thought it was interesting because it is such a I think season 4 in particular got so dark. It went from being this like fun, silly teens are being teens and also there's some monsters we have to fight to at parts where I was like, this is too scary. I don't want to watch this. Um
It's a lot.
yeah,
It's a lot.
it's wild, and I think I do think to some degree that setup of watching. I'm you know what? If you haven't watched season 4, which I guess is reasonable, the next stretch is going to be spoilery. So
Oh, I'm excited if I get to talk
yeah, I
spoilers.
think we
Yeah.
got to talk about it. I just think
Yeah.
I think it's one of the few topics on this show that is actively happening right now. So I think we got to talk about it. Um, so, all of that being said, spoilers forthcoming. Season 4, when it comes to the reality of death in this show, to me, they set it up in such a specific way by instantly, and unfortunately, with the timing of what's going on in the world, showing you that kids can die in this show
Yeah.
brutally and awfully. Um, and sort of trying to tease the idea that perhaps the character you love most is the character who is capable of that kind of violence, which ultimately obviously is a twist and it's set up to make you feel that way and start to view Eleven's actions in the rest of the season through that lens of violence. But
Hmm.
I think what was interesting about it is that they did say kids can die, but they ultimately decided, but maybe not these kids. Maybe these kids are going to be okay.
Yeah, what's the value of that, Like I think they could have gotten away with it in like season 3, but it gets to the point where, every character that dies is mourned in this show and it becomes like part of someone to the point where like they didn't think they didn't think Barb was going to be a big deal in season 1. It was, but that was like Nancy's whole thing in season 2. It's like, nobody cares about Barb except for me.
Right.
Like, even if other people don't necessarily, and that's often what happens is a character dies and then other people have moved on with their lives because that's how death works. But the person who's closest to them, they don't move on.
Yeah.
Yeah. And even then, like, you watch that scene, and there's certain things like Hopper's death in season 3 with like 20 minutes after it happened. I'm like, he's not dead.
Yeah.
And here's why he's not dead. For one, they've been very clear showing goo piles of like everyone who's died in this specific way, like very, very like showing bodies.
Yeah.
But also they played a song it's the first time they played a song for a second time in the show. And it's the same song that played when Will's fake body was found. So I'm just like, oh, cool. He's alive. And then,
I did not know that. I didn't catch that one.
Yeah, when he's writing his letter, if you watch that song plays in season 1. I think it's a David Bowie song. And this gets into the details, right? Once you learn their language, like continuing spoilers for season 4, they introduce 5, I want to say, new high schoolers.
Mm-hmm.
And by 3 episodes in, 3 of them are dead. So it's just like, okay, what do you think are going to happen to the other 2?
Yeah.
Right? Like, it told you.
Yeah.
And also, the 3 characters that died all had a perceived deficiency, whether it being, an eating disorder for one, an accidental death for one. I don't remember what the third was, but like, it's like, cool. They have this thing that is incorrect.
Yeah.
Like, it's not true. And then you have this other character who's like, oh, I need to do this, or I'm always running away, or I'm like, yeah, they're telling you this character's dead.
Yeah. So I will agree with your assertion about death in Stranger Things. If you could see me, I'm talking massively with my hands right now. I will agree with your assertion about death in Stranger Things, except for Eddie Munson. And the only reason I disagree with it for him, I don't feel that necessarily he didn't have to die. I just felt like it was the only time that that his attempt to deal with his deficiency didn't work, because I thought it was this idea of kind of, and I think maybe actually it came down to the world building. It wasn't necessarily Eddie Munson as a character's fault in his arc, because I loved the concept of, I didn't run away this time, and that ultimately fixing this flaw that he believes about himself that is not necessarily actually a flaw is what, leads to his untimely death, which makes sense and fits that theme. So I agree with that assertion. The only thing I didn't like was that I did not have the foggiest idea why these vampire bats were so important and why they had to be pulled in the way that they had to be pulled, because they just didn't, for me, it just didn't make sense, because they had gotten them into the house. The distraction had been done. And so the extra level of it that led to his death didn't necessarily have to be something that paid off, worked, or whatever. But I just, as a viewer, was like, I need one more step of explanation as to why these bats matter.
That's fair. And that's, I think this was a downside of how long the season was.
Yeah.
Because if you look at like like how things happen in order, like they summon the bats and then they go inside, and then shortly after the bats start leaving, once the bats have figured out that like, oh, these people, are going into this house. Like they're gonna go eat them.
Yeah.
And so now he's like, cool, and I think also Dustin was at it's similar to Bob's death in that, Bob dying did kind of save Joyce and Hopper.
Yeah.
But you didn't have to, right? And I think that's the thing, is just the Bob death feels better than the Eddie death, because it's one of the only things happening on the screen, whereas people are joking about like these characters are getting choked for like 50 minutes straight. I'm like, but they're not. It's just we have like 5 stories to tell right now. And that, and that was like ultimately like I loved this season. Like a lot of people I've talked to, it's their favorite season, or at least their favorite since season 1, and it's not mine.
Okay.
But I love them all for like specific reasons. And also after 3 years of not having the show, I'm happy if the problem is it's just too long, right? If like it actually didn't suffer as many problems as I anticipated. Like I was talking to, I think, Sarah Golub about like the Russia plot, and she's like, this feels like a lot. I'm like, well, yeah, they clearly shot most of Russia before the pandemic happened. That was designed for a 9-hour season. Yeah. Right. And they pulled it together in those last like 3 or 4 episodes, but there's definitely like season 4 and 5. There's moments where I'm like, this is, not working quite at like the level of chop But also, like, I'm like, you guys earned it. Like,
Yeah.
I love the show. I'm not gonna be mad about extra time. So for my like experience with like Eddie's death, for example, I had assumed like I'm like, you're dead, right? He
Yeah.
wasn't killed by Vecna, but he was killed by Vecna.
Yeah.
He was killed because of Vecna,
Right.
right? And that's kind of what makes his death interesting because like all 5 of those people who died got killed by Vecna, whether directly or indirectly, but all because of the same thing and all because of like a false read on themselves. Like
hmm
when he said like I didn't run away, for me that was tragic
Yeah. Agreed.
because it was unnecessary, right?
Yeah.
I would argue, and I haven't gone back and watched it a second time, that he did save Dustin. Like
Dustin's
I
already through the he's back in Hawkins. He's out of the upside
by
down
the time he goes down.
Yeah, by the time because it's
Okay. Well,
so
I'd have to, and so I was thinking like, okay, Dustin went back out there.
yeah.
But like, I don't know. I get what the character was thinking, and I got what, and to me, that was why it was tragic. Like, I was just like, no, you don't need to do this. Like, but the reason he did it was because of like this thing the town had put on him. Um, and in the same way where people, and I think part of like what made it foggy was at the end when they're like, oh, he was a hero. I'm like, he wasn't a hero because he got killed by bats. He was a hero in the same way where Jonathan and Nancy and Robin and all of them are heroes because they played their part in trying to save the town, you know?
Yeah.
Like, and so, and that, I feel like that is an issue. Like the way that this story is told is usually so tight and almost so like there's no room for excess. And like in season 3, I'm like, I would have loved a scene of Eleven and Hopper just like watching TV together.
Yeah.
Like, just one scene. That would have done a lot for me. But at the same time, notice that I know that scene exists, right? I know that happened.
Yeah.
They didn't actually need to put it in the show because they established that it happens in the show. And oftentimes, like, the status quo gets broken like the moment the show starts. Like, we get a hint of what life has been like, and now we're going, right? And there's no room. And so for season 4, I loved that there was extra time to like actually have a lot of these conversations they don't normally take time for.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it showed me the cost of like, okay, this is what would happen if I always got what I want, is like you would have times where things I don't think land as hard. And Eddie's also just a case of like, he was almost miscast because he was not meant to be that great.
Good.
You know?
Like,
he was meant to be loved. The best way for that death to land would be to get a less charismatic actor. Because like Eddie was in season 4 is season 2's Will, or season 1's Will. Right, he's a device. Like there are times people are like, he's not in the show like a lot. I'm like, yeah, because he's not meant to. Like the internet's telling you this is the only character in the show. And I love all the Eddie love. There was like people were like going on about like death is bad and blah the first couple days, and that was my first experience of fandom of being like, you guys aren't like if you're gonna fan out, like fan out. And I'm all about like love media the way you love, but you're criticizing things that are literal choices that were made for a specific reason as if they weren't made. You could disagree with the choice, but it wasn't like accidental why that went across. Like, especially if you like paid a lot of attention to previous seasons. So like, he was a device. Like that was his thing in the season. He was the thing that got you into the mystery. And in this case, it's not a kid's missing. It's we need to help this guy go missing because he's a murder suspect.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I'd have to go back. I ultimately like that death did fuck me up. And like a lot of my experience watching it is like, ooh, because I'm like, how are they going to do this? These bats are brutal. And I do think they handled like what they showed well. Cause I'm like, man, like characters have died in brutal ways in the show before, but I think it just hits different when it's like a teen you've gotten used to.
Yeah. Yeah. I think something to get, I guess this will be my last season 4 spoiler, and then we'll move back into sort of your relationship with the show and wrap it up. But I think with Eddie in particular, you sort of get this thing in fandom that happened with Billy as well, which I thought was interesting, which is that you take this character who you don't know before they come in, you only learn like who they are in a very short amount of time. And then they have some level of tragic death. But the opposite reaction I thought was interesting because Billy, the fandom really had a meltdown about him being killed as well. And then
did they?
Yeah, they did.
I didn't know how to get to fandom at the time. Like,
yeah,
for me,
no, it was wild. Um,
Billy has a tragic backstory, but Billy's also like racist, you know?
Billy's also
Billy's an abusive
torturing
person. Like,
Max, yeah, and
yeah,
and
I'm like, he's not a good person.
no, and I do think Stranger Things almost has this battle where the writing was right, but they casted these actors who were so good at their jobs that it almost
Mhm.
battles to a degree where you're like, you're right. The purpose of Eddie Munson and the purpose of Billy Hargrove, excuse me,
Yeah.
but the purpose of Billy and the purpose of Eddie was to take these characters who you don't really get to know a lot about, make you feel enough that their death feels impactful and
Yeah.
understand that it matters to the story. But then they've brought on these actors that are just so good that you think, well, that was the best part of this season. This was something
Yeah.
new. This was something great. Um, and it almost, I think, causes the fans to ignore the writing to some degree. Um,
Mhm.
but what I think is interesting about that to now, I suppose, tie it back and remove ourselves from spoiler land. So if you're tuning back in from your jump, welcome back.
Welcome back.
We are talking about Billy and Eddie and the impeccable actors that they put in those roles. But what I think is interesting about why the fans get so excited about those characters is that it almost seems like it's the same thing that attracted you to the show in the first place, which is I see something in these actors on screen that appeals to
Mhm.
me. Um,
Yeah. I mean, it's Steve 2.0, like Steve 1.0, 2.0, and 3.0.
yeah,
Like Billy is the Steve that they meant to write,
right?
and then they cast a guy who's really charismatic. And even Eddie, they're just like, oh, we filmed like, because you had like Chrissy, and they're like, oh, we already like knew what everyone's like what was going to happen at the end of season episode 1 before we filmed that scene
Yeah.
where of like, and for this is a non-spoiler thing for people, Eddie Munson, who's one of the main characters in season 4, has this really fun interaction with the cheerleader, and they're like, oh, we would have done things differently had we known, like
We
had
know
we
that
done
they
this
had
scene
amazing
first,
chemistry,
because
right?
the chemistry is incredible, and I'm glad they didn't.
Yeah.
But and that was like Steve was meant to be Billy, and so then in season 2 they're like, cool, now we're actually gonna do Billy. They're like, we're actually gonna do the human
Yeah.
antagonist, and we're gonna have him be a counter to Steve, which is fun. But is it just like, do people just really like long-haired like white dudes?
You
Is
know,
that
I don't know if it's that or if it's like I think I think
because
the
I love
Duffer
these characters
Brothers.
too. Like I love their
Yeah.
performances, but at the same time, I'm just like, there's a lot of actors like this in the or there's a lot of actors that kind of deserve. Like I notice a lot of queer reading of certain characters in season 4, which I was
Yeah.
very in favor of, but at this like dismissal of the canonical two queer characters, right? It's like we have one character who's recently, come out and has one person they're out to, and it's trying to navigate queerness that way. And then we have a younger person who, and I get this was like a frustrating thing for a lot of people, and I don't disagree with that. At the same time, I'm like, this is a 5-season arc, and like this character's gay. Like we've do they need to say out loud? And I get for representation, like, yeah, unfortunately they do.
Yeah.
And so like you have two like kind of queer narrative focuses, and all the attention's been given to these characters that I think it's fair to read as queer, but at the same time, I'm like, that's not their journey. So that was interesting for me of being engaged with the fandom and being like, because there were like, some people made, and I think this was just like speaks to how impactful the finale was. Like there were people who were like mad and frustrated the night or two after, and were like, this isn't fair to XYZ. And I'm like, that's not what happened. Like,
Right.
you're no okay. Just like I'm over in my corner, like, okay.
Yeah. I think with the Steve, Billy, and Eddie of it all, I think what it is they've casted these amazing actors for those roles. But I think
Yeah.
also if you look at the fact that Steve was supposed to die in season 1,
Hmm.
and they essentially fell to in love with Joe Kearney, and they were like, we're just, he's staying, he's safe. Um, and then you see the arc that they took him on. I think that's where the appeal for these other characters comes from, is that
Yeah.
it's all the same archetype, like you said. But we've seen, okay, if you don't kill these people off, the Duffer Brothers really know how to write an arc where you get to see that person grow. And I
Yeah.
wonder if maybe that's what it is it's the Billy of it all and the Eddie of it all is, I know that you could do if these characters could just live on for, obviously for 4 seasons, I could have another Steve who I care for
R
deeply.
right. Yeah, that's fair,
Yeah.
and I'm never gonna be mad about people really liking
Yeah.
I've enjoyed the fan art, I've enjoyed the theories, like,
Yeah.
there's these, like people are getting into, like, deep DNA D&D lore, and this is a case where I'm just like, I don't know, I think the Duffers and I have, like, drank a lot of the same Kool-Aid,
Yeah.
because my D&D experience in high school was the Hellfire Club,
Okay.
right? Metalhead theater kids playing Dungeons and Dragons with Iron Maiden on in the background, like, if your big fight does not equate whatever, like, heavy metal song we're into,
Yeah.
you have failed, and that's, the 'cause I make my living on a Dungeons& and Dragons show, which is absurd. Like, I'm the lead editor on a show called Dungeons& and Daddies.
Okay.
It's the most successful thing I will probably ever be involved in, 'cause I'm doing it with, like, some of the most successful creators on the internet, and it's the biggest thing they've ever done.
Yeah.
So and none of them, like, were D&D players. And so D&D is, like, now become part of my daily life in a way that's wild when I look back to when I was in, like, middle school, and I was playing and it was, like, closer to, like, season 1. But then when I was in high school and we were getting people into D&D, it was 100% the, like, Iron Maiden and Dio and all of that in the background. I'm like, "Okay, I'm glad they get to see." I'm glad the public who, like, a lot of them, this kind of, like, give them an ownership of over Dungeons& and Dragons,
Yeah.
gets to see this side of it, because that side, I'm like, "That was me."
Yeah, no, I think so the thing that's cool about that is that D&D, it sounds like did you was it a cool experience to watch something that then became sort of now it's this huge pop culture thing where everyone is like, "Oh, Eddie Munson is the coolest person in the world." Um, when that's obviously like kind of it was an outsider thing. I don't imagine when you were in the Hellfire Club, so to speak, of your heyday,
Mhm.
that people thought it was the coolest thing.
So my high school experience, like, the cliques and stereotypes certainly existed, but there was no, like, supremacy or dominance.
Okay.
Nobody was bothered by us, like, dressing, like, listening to loud music and playing Dungeons& and Dragons.
Yeah.
Like, no, we were friends with footballers, we were friends with, we were all kind of, like, mingled with each other, so you had those, like, groups and you had flavors of them. But, like, I didn't feel like not cool. I mean, being cool is just not really relevant to me in high school, but, like, I don't, like, maybe it was because I grew up in I was a kid, we would get in fights with, like, the kids in the other neighborhoods when they, like, came to our turf, so to say, which, I now looking back, I'm like, "That's insane." Um, but usually if someone tried to, like, give me a hard time in middle school and high school, like, we would just attack them. And so I don't know if there was just this air of, like, don't mess with me and we won't get in a fight.
Yeah.
And not saying, like, I didn't get in, like, that many fights, and usually if I was getting in fights, it was with someone who was, like, picking on someone. Um, but maybe that was it, that we just weren't opposed to, like, throwing down.
Well, I mean, to some degree, though, I think there's a level of that's who Eddie and that
Well, and
characters are.
and I judge Eddie for that,
Yeah.
right? Like, I'm like, "Eddie, you're kind of an asshole."
Yeah.
Like, if you look at, like, episode 1 Eddie, I'm like, you're making a lot of you're doing what you're accusing other people of doing."
Yeah.
Like, I don't think that's true on, like, the meta level of, like, looking at, like, okay, what we can infer about this person's background, but for the scenes we see, I'm just like, you know,
Yeah.
and so for me, it was more like I had a lot of fun in high school. Like, I liked doing, our plays, and then the next day, like, playing just the most heavy metal games of D&D for like 8 hours, and then going hiking in the woods. Like, I enjoyed doing that a lot. And
Yeah.
so for me, it's less the, like, oh, this is validating, and it's more of like, I'm glad other people get to see how much fun this is.
It's like a sharing of something wonderful in a different
Yeah,
degree.
and that was something that, like, I think season 4 has done a good job with, of, like, some, like, different metal bands have commented on season 4, and someone was like, "Oh, we're the real, like, Metallica fans," and Metallica's like, "No, we're overjoyed that a bunch of people are gonna discover us now." Like, if they liked the songs that they used in the season, they're probably gonna like the other music too. This is great.
Yeah. Yeah, I did see that comment on I think it was Instagram, right? Or maybe TikTok. But
Yeah.
I did see that where they were like, "Sorry for all the fake fans from Stranger Things." And they were like,
Yeah.
No, we're thrilled. Welcome."
Also, like, well, and I think this is another, like, a theory of an appeal of, like, Eddie or, like, Hellfire Club, is it when you see a piece of media that you really love, it gives you a sense of like ownership and history with something you might not have been able to engage with the way you wanted to when you were younger.
Yeah.
So like a lot of metalheads were seen as like a version of cool and maybe in a way of like inaccessible. Like I wasn't like you'd put me more in the theater kid than the metalhead kid,
Okay.
based on visuals because I grew up Mormon and I wasn't allowed to wear an Iron Maiden shirt, even if
Yeah.
that's all I was listening to. But with the but I was friends with all of them, and they were all fun people, right? It was
Yeah.
like a fairly accessible group. Like the assumptions about them were not correct.
Yeah.
And so now people who didn't necessarily engage with that when they're younger get to be like, oh, I like D&D. Oh, and now I'm enjoying, Kate Bush, or I'm enjoying metal, or I'm enjoying this. And I think these characters give them an avenue to like take ownership over something that they might have liked when they were younger if they could go back. And I think that's beautiful. Like I'm all as someone who's like very much a part of like that, I felt extremely represented by the Hellfire Club. I'm like everyone's welcome here.
Yeah.
I think D&D could really use like there's this thing in role-playing games called the old school Renaissance, OSR, which is a lot of people who are going back to like 80s and 90s D&D and just cleaning it up and finding weirder versions to play it.
Mhm.
Um and that's something that does really well is it's very pulpy and it's very heavy metal. And I think shows that I love like Critical Role have done the opposite of like these maximalist shows that show you what it's like to truly live in a world through D&D. They're also missing some of the like riding a winged Pegasus over a lightning storm while being chased by a dragon being ridden by a lich. you know and so I'm hoping this helps nudge things in that direction because that's a great way of playing D&D.
Yeah.
The current version of the game doesn't necessarily support it, but you can still manage it. They get Vecna stats. Vecna was never meant to have stats, but it's fine. For people who didn't play D&D, and haven't read all those old, like the fourth D&D book ever, like before we even really had first edition, introduced. Here's a little detail for you that people are doing fun theories of. There were like a list of 20 artifacts, and it was this like Gygax was just going on a little rant about like, oh, now that players own D&D books, they know all of our secrets, so we need to find new ways to keep secrets away from them.
Okay.
So here's this weird cult-looking book that not as many of them will buy, and also here's the powers, but you're going to roll the powers, so when they pick up your Hand of Vecna, it's not going to be the same as someone else's Hand of Vecna.
Okay.
And you had 3 items among like 20 of like cool items, and one was the Hand and the Eye of Vecna, which the whole deal is if you pick up the Hand of Vecna, you're going to cut off your own hand and replace it with the Hand of Vecna. And now you get super powerful, but you get evil. That's why Vecna in this season had like one really big hand. It was a reference to that. And also Freddy Krueger. But, and like the eye was the same. And there's this joke about the head of Vecna of like, oh, players would get the head of Vecna and chop off their own head and then they would just die. It was like a prank. But you also had the Sword of Cass, which was also part of Vecna's origin, which was like Vecna's lieutenant who like got betrayed by Vecna and then they killed each other. And so in episode 1, when you get the big Vecna D&D reveal, like Mike yells, Cass killed him. And I'm what, people are starting to theorize like, and I love that I'm seeing these Tumblr kids like get in, like they know who Cass is now, because the answer is Cass is a description of an item in a book that came out in like the late 70s, right? But I love that about Eddie. Eddie's absolutely one of those people who would be reading reading between the lines of these books and going, how do I do a campaign? Right. This is just one paragraph of lore. How do I turn that into a whole campaign?
Yeah.
Like they did good with all that. And it's fun. And yeah, I hope people kind of bring that to their own lives. Because it seems like season 4 has been like very popular. Like I'm seeing way more people talk about it than I ever saw talk about season 2 or 3.
Yeah, I believe it broke Netflix's streaming record. I think, or maybe Squid Game is still ahead of it, but it's like quite
God,
quite
Squid
big.
Game's very good.
Yes, very true. That's a whole nother show.
Whole other show.
Well, okay, so I think what's lovely about this, and it's like a nice point to sort of wrap our conversation up, is that it sounds like the show that sort of got you into being a fan is also creating a space for the things that make you who you are to become more accessible to people. And I think there's something really lovely about that. There's something really lovely about seeing something very specific about yourself represented in a way that's being celebrated in the show that makes you want to celebrate a show. So I think that's cool.
It's definitely like that part is validating on, oh, the show continues to bring in things that like I feel like were part of my experience
Yeah.
even years later of just like, cool, this rules. And it doesn't have to do that,
Right.
right? But it feels like it was made for me, right? It feels like, all right, if you have a target demographic, I am at like the needle point of that demographic.
Okay, well, so I'm gonna hit you with the final question I ask everybody. If you had never seen Stranger Things, what do you think would be different about yourself today?
I think I mean, for one, I wouldn't have like a good piece of comfort media that would be good for like resetting myself.
Mhm.
But I think I would just like lack the same creative focus. Like having a piece of media that does appeal to me, but is also full of detail and good craft that I can almost study, like I can enjoy and study at the same time. And that can be like any kind of media, but for me, it's this
Yeah.
it's really good for reflection and it works as a kind of focus in that I'm like, cool, when I'm making stuff myself, it like on the wall behind my computer right now, it's covered in sticky notes because I just forget things all the time, including like I'll write a script, forget I wrote the script, and later try to write the script and then come back and be like, oh, I already did this.
Yeah.
And so I try to put little symbols on my wall to remind myself, like, you've already done this, you already did the hard work. Trust you from 2 years ago, they weren't an idiot or any more so than you are now. And this show, I think, does that for me as well. It's an external example. It's something I can never predict, right?
Yeah.
I have my ideas of season 5, and they're all going to be wrong for the better. Like, I think my ideas for season 5 would be good, but they managed to surprise. Like, it's a show I can't be smart about, and that's wonderful
Yeah.
because I just get to enjoy it and be surprised. Even when we were talking before of like, oh, being able to predict specific stuff, that's different, right? Because that's
Right.
just creative language. But this just gives me a consistent point where it's refreshed every once in a while because like every couple of years they put out another season. And it just gives me as a creator something that I am able to enjoy the way like I want people to enjoy my stuff.
Yeah.
And it's this kind of constant like this North Star while I'm making other stuff and going through different like throes of life that helps like reset me to my best creative instincts. And that works in a way like I'm never going to make anything like Stranger Things. I don't want to, but I do want to make things the way that Stranger Things is made. And I think like that's kind of how I go about it. Um, like David Harbour has this beautiful thing where, I'll like big fan of David as just as a performer and as like his approach to the arts. But there was a panel and someone asked like, essentially, how do I get to where you're at now? And he's like, this is a byproduct, right? This isn't the goal. Like you make things make things you're proud of with people you like. And one day that might put you like in the spotlight and you'll end up here. But this is just like an extra thing. Like he's like, he was like in some stuff, but mostly he was just a New York theater guy through his like 40s,
Mhm.
from
Yeah.
when he was young. And like he found a way to live and create in a way that was validating for him. And like when none of them knew Stranger Things was going to be this big, but he loved it.
Yeah.
And that's another thing I love about the show is you can tell everyone here loves this show. They are all happy to come back and hang out with their friends. But that's just so like the way I approach creativity because people will be like, oh, download numbers, money, all of that. And I'm like, those things can be important and you should utilize them and take advantage of them. But at the same time, like if nobody was paying attention to this stuff, I would still be making it.
Yeah.
It might like inform what I decide to make of like 3 ideas if I think one will resonate more with like a current audience. But that's to me like what being creative is you can't make it with, I think it's good to have goals. But if you're only making it to achieve a goal, like you don't have control over that. And you're probably not going to make something that's going to resonate because people aren't going to want to like buy into your story because you're being a little too transactional about it.
I love that.
So
Yeah. So I think this is true for Stranger Things and what is so appealing about it to you and how it connects is sort of make what you want to make with the people you want to make it with, and ultimately that means that someone will connect with it. So
yeah.
I think that's really beautiful. Um
Thanks so much for letting me come on and talk about one of my favorite things is
yeah.
rules.
Yeah. Thanks for
What great podcast.
I think there's something really wonderful about getting to talk about what you love and getting to listen to people talk about what you love. I feel I know more about you than I did before we started. So,
Yeah.
well, Well, Esther, thank you so much for joining me today and talking about Stranger Things, and most importantly, giving me a chance to put my feelings about Eddie Munson and Steve Harrington on tape for public consumption. For everybody else, we will be back next week with Berklie, who you may know better as at Icaruspendragon on TikTok. We're going to be talking about how Supernatural not only changed her life for the show, but the fandom that came with it gave her a platform and changed sort of her direction in life. So be sure to tune in next Wednesday for that. Between now and then, if you'd like to let me know what you thought about the episode or sign up for my newsletter, you can find me on Twitter at Marissa Kamari, and you can find our newsletter on our website at tandonproductions.com. Until then, keep loving what you love, and I will see you next Wednesday.